In this gripping tale, we follow the journey of Elijah Sanders, a man who faces a devastating injustice that turns his life upside down. After being wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit, Elijah struggles to find his way through a system that seems designed to break him. But in the face of adversity, he chooses to fight back, seeking not only justice for himself, but also for the entire community. With the support of his family and allies, he stands tall against those in power, demanding accountability and a change to the corrupt system that allowed his suffering. His resilience sparks a chain of events that lead to a profound transformation, not only in his life, but in the lives of those around him. This story is a testament to the power of one person's determination to make a difference and how courage can ignite a movement. Before we dive into this gripping tale of resilience, justice, and redemption, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this powerful story of Elijah's fight for justice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories coming your way. Captain Elijah Sanders was finally home. The 2 years he had spent commanding international military operations had pushed him to his limits. It wasn't just the relentless physical exhaustion of leading missions in unforgiving terrains. It was also the mental strain of making life-or-death decisions daily. Tonight, however, he left the battlefield behind. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of his responsibilities was momentarily lifted. As he drove through the quiet streets of his suburban hometown, Elijah savored the familiar surroundings. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated rows of tidy homes, their well-maintained yards exuding a sense of peace that was foreign to the chaos he had left behind. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the approaching fall, and the faint scent of pine mingled with damp earth. For Elijah, this tranquil neighborhood was more than just a place. It was a refuge. The Sanders family had made this small town their home years ago, drawn by its charm. It wasn't flashy or modern, but its simplicity had always appealed to Elijah. After years spent in deserts and mountains where every sound could mean danger, this serene town felt like stepping into a dream. The thought of his wife Amanda waiting for him brought a rare smile to his face. Amanda's text earlier that evening had been a mundane reminder to pick up groceries on his way home. Yet to Elijah, the simple task felt almost surreal. After months of strategy briefings, high-pressure missions, and protocol, the thought of milk and bread seemed laughably ordinary, but also deeply comforting. He slowed his car as he passed the neighborhood park, where his children, Lily and Jack, used to play. Their laughter, long absent from his memories, filled his mind. He had missed so much: birthdays, backyard games, and quiet mornings at the kitchen table. Now, as the night whispered promises of peace, Elijah allowed himself to imagine a weekend of barbecues, lake trips, and simply being dad again. The streets were nearly empty, with only a stray car or two parked along the sidewalks. A cat darted across the road, its tail a shadow in the headlights. Elijah chuckled softly, easing the car window down. The cool night air rolled in, brushing against his face and stirring a moment of gratitude in his chest. The car radio played a soft jazz tune, blending seamlessly with the quiet around him. Elijah's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his fingers unconsciously tracing its contours. For these few minutes, he wasn't Captain Sanders, a man whose commands could shift the tides of international relations. He was just Elijah, a husband, a father, and a neighbor. As his car meandered through the streets, his mind drifted to the homecoming earlier in the week. He had returned to a whirlwind of hugs and tears at the airport. Jack and Lily had practically tackled him, their arms squeezing as if afraid he might vanish again. Amanda's embrace had been no less fervent, her whispered words of pride muffled against his shoulder. That moment had made all the sacrifices feel worthwhile. Yet, Elijah couldn't ignore the subtle challenges of transition. Moving from the structured chaos of military life to the slow rhythm of suburban peace wasn't something training prepared him for. He often found himself caught between two worlds, one filled with urgency and danger, the other with quiet and routine. But tonight, as the town's stillness embraced him, Elijah felt an unexpected ease, as if he had finally crossed the bridge between those two realities. Turning onto Main Street, Elijah spotted the glowing neon sign of the local grocery store. The parking lot was sparsely populated, with only a few cars scattered across its expanse. He pulled into a space close to the entrance and sat for a moment, relishing the silence. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss as he entered the store, and the bright fluorescent lights washed over him. He grabbed a basket and moved methodically through the aisles, his military discipline guiding even the simplest tasks. Milk, bread, eggs, fruit. Each item dropped into the basket with practiced efficiency, a stark contrast to the logistical complexities he used to juggle. At the checkout counter, the cashier, a teenager with tired eyes, offered him a polite smile. Elijah nodded in return, swiping his card and collecting his bags. The mundane exchange grounded him further. This was home. This was normal. As Elijah loaded the groceries into the back seat of his car, he paused to take another deep breath of the cool night air. In just a few minutes, he would walk through his front door, where Amanda would greet him with that smile that always reassured him. Everything would be okay, she would silently promise, and he would believe her. Starting the car again, Elijah pulled onto the main road, his thoughts already drifting to the weekend ahead. He and Amanda had made plans to catch up on everything they had missed, a family barbecue, maybe even a trip to the lake. His smile widened at the thought of grilling burgers and splashing in the water with the kids. It was the kind of joy he had spent 2 years yearning for. That's when he noticed the headlights in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it. A car on a quiet road wasn't unusual, even this late. But the vehicle stayed behind him, its headlights bright and constant. As it drew closer, Elijah's pulse quickened. It wasn't just any car, it was a police cruiser. His grip on the steering wheel tightened instinctively. He wasn't speeding, and his taillights were working. There was no reason for alarm. Still, the cruiser remained uncomfortably close, its shape unmistakable against the dimly lit street. Then came the flash of red and blue lights, slicing through the night like a siren call. Elijah's heart sank. He pulled to the side of the road, his movements steady and calm. Years of training kept his nerves in check, though unease coiled tightly in his stomach. This had to be a routine stop, he told himself. Perhaps a broken taillight he hadn't noticed, or a minor misunderstanding. Reaching for his ID and registration, Elijah glanced in the rearview mirror. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, his silhouette illuminated by the flashing lights. Something about his stride, firm and fast, didn't sit right with Elijah. As the officer approached, Elijah rolled down his window and nodded politely. The man's name badge glinted in the light, Officer Matthew Cole. License and registration, the officer barked. Elijah handed over the documents, keeping his voice calm. Here you go, officer. I'm Captain Elijah Sanders with the United States Army. Cole barely glanced at the documents before his lips pressed into a thin line. Step out of the vehicle, he ordered abruptly. Confusion flickered across Elijah's face, but he complied. His training took over, and he moved with deliberate slowness, hands visible, showing no sign of threat. What's this about? Elijah asked evenly. The response was immediate and shocking. Cole grabbed Elijah's arm roughly, yanking him toward the hood of the car. Before Elijah could process what was happening, he was slammed against the metal, the chill of it biting through his shirt. The night's tranquility shattered in an instant. But this was just the beginning of a storm Elijah never saw coming. Elijah's chest pressed against the cold surface of the car hood, his breath shallow and sharp as the weight of Officer Cole's grip bore down on him. The situation had escalated far too quickly, leaving him reeling with confusion and disbelief. Moments ago, he had been peacefully driving home, thinking about his family. Now his dignity was being stripped away in an instant. Stay still. You're under arrest for resisting, Cole snapped, his voice hard and clipped. For what? Elijah managed, his voice steady despite the surge of anger rising within him. I haven't done anything wrong. But Cole wasn't listening. The officer's hand pressed firmly against Elijah's back, while his other hand twisted Elijah's arms into an uncomfortable position. The metallic click of handcuffs followed, the cold steel biting into Elijah's wrists. Resisting? Elijah thought, his mind racing. How could I resist when I wasn't even given a chance to respond? The street, once quiet and empty, was no longer deserted. The commotion had drawn the attention of nearby residents, and a small crowd had started to gather. Some held up their phones, recording the scene. Faces in the growing crowd reflected a mixture of shock, outrage, and disbelief. "That's Captain Sanders," someone shouted from the sidewalk, their voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Yeah, the soldier. He's been on the news," another voice chimed in, louder now. Elijah felt a flicker of embarrassment amidst his growing anger. His name was now being murmured through the crowd, people recognizing him for the decorated service member he was. But it didn't seem to matter to Cole. To the officer, Elijah was just another suspect. "General, huh?" Cole sneered, misinterpreting the murmurs in the crowd. He spat the word out like it was an insult. "Well, you should have followed orders faster." Elijah clenched his jaw, the officer's dismissive tone fueling the frustration burning inside him. Years of disciplined training as a soldier told him to remain calm, to diffuse situations rather than escalate them. But in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing sense of injustice grew. "You don't even know who I am," Elijah said firmly, meeting Cole's gaze for the first time. "I don't care who you are," Cole retorted, tightening his grip on the cuffs as he began leading Elijah toward the police cruiser. The crowd on the sidewalk erupted in protest. "Leave him alone. He hasn't done anything. This is why we don't trust cops." Despite the clamor, Cole seemed oblivious, his focus solely on maintaining control of the situation. But as Elijah was forced closer to the patrol car, another set of headlights approached. This time it was another police cruiser. The newcomer parked hastily, and a petite woman stepped out. Her uniform was crisp, her posture firm yet cautious. Her name badge read, Officer Jessica Lane. As she approached the scene, her sharp eyes took in every detail. The restrained man in handcuffs, the aggressive stance of her colleague, and the murmuring, agitated crowd. "Officer Cole," she called, her voice authoritative but calm. "What's going on here?" Cole didn't respond right away, and his body language was still tense. "Pulled him over for suspicious behavior," he said finally, his tone defensive. "He resisted, so I'm detaining him." Lane's eyes flicked to Elijah, recognition flashing across her face. "Captain Elijah Sanders?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with shock. "Yes," Elijah replied, his voice measured but carrying the weight of suppressed anger. Lane's expression shifted instantly. She turned back to Cole, her voice now carrying a sharper edge. "Are you out of your mind?" Cole hesitated, visibly caught off guard by her reaction. "What? Do you know who he is?" Lane asked, her voice lowering but brimming with incredulity. "He's a decorated officer, a national hero." Cole's grip on Elijah faltered, his eyes widening. For the first time, doubt crept into his rigid demeanor. "A hero?" Cole muttered, almost to himself. "Yes," Lane confirmed firmly. She stepped between them, her body language making it clear that she was taking control of the situation. "Uncuff him, now." Cole's hesitation stretched unbearably long. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their anger palpable. Someone yelled, "You better do what she says." Finally, Cole fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs. Elijah rubbed his wrists, the skin red and raw where the metal had dug in. "Captain Sanders," Lane began, her tone apologetic, "I am so sorry for what's happened. This should never have." "Save it," Elijah interrupted, his voice low but cutting. "You didn't slam me against the hood of a car." Lane's face tightened, guilt flickering in her eyes. The crowd wasn't letting up. Phones were still raised, recording every second. More voices called out, "We want justice," and "This is unacceptable." Cole stepped back, his face pale and sweat beginning to form on his brow. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by the realization of what he had done and what it would cost him. "I didn't know," he mumbled weakly, his eyes darting between Elijah, Lane, and the restless crowd. "I didn't know who you were." Elijah turned to face him fully, his tall frame and unwavering gaze exuding a quiet authority. "That's the problem, Officer Cole," Elijah said, his voice steady but sharp. "It shouldn't matter who I am. I could be a general or a janitor. You saw the color of my skin and decided I was a threat." "That's all it took, wasn't it?" Cole flinched as if the words physically struck him. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The crowd grew more vocal, their outrage boiling over. Lane quickly stepped forward, raising her hands to address them. "Please, everyone, calm down," she urged. "We will handle this situation, I promise you." But the crowd wasn't convinced. Their chants grew louder, demanding accountability. Lane reached for her radio, calling in a sergeant to the scene. She knew this had spiraled beyond her control and required immediate intervention. As they waited, Elijah stood tall, his composure unshaken despite the humiliation he had just endured. The anger simmering beneath his calm exterior wasn't just for himself. It was for every person who had been treated like this, or worse, without the privilege of cameras and a watching crowd. When Sergeant Harold Barnes arrived, his face was a mask of professionalism, though his eyes betrayed the tension he felt. He quickly assessed the scene as Lane briefed him. The sergeant's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as he turned to Cole. "Officer Cole," Barnes began, his voice firm. "Step aside." Cole obeyed, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Turning to Elijah, Barnes extended a hand. "Captain Sanders, I deeply apologize for what's occurred tonight. This is unacceptable, and I assure you there will be an immediate investigation." Elijah looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment before shaking it briefly. His gaze was piercing as he spoke. "You've said the right words, Sergeant. Now let's see if there's action behind them." The sergeant nodded solemnly, clearly aware of the scrutiny he was under, not just from Elijah, but from the crowd and the cameras. As the situation began to de-escalate, Lane escorted Elijah back to his car. Before he climbed in, she stopped him. "I know this doesn't fix anything," she said softly, "but I'll make sure this is taken seriously." Bookmark. Go back." Elijah paused, then nodded curtly. "I hope so," he said before driving off, leaving the flashing lights and the murmurs of the crowd behind. By the time Elijah Sanders walked through his front door, the weight of the evening hung heavy on him. His wife Amanda greeted him with wide, worried eyes. She had seen the video. "Elijah," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. For a long moment, neither spoke. Amanda's hands trembled as they gripped the fabric of his shirt. "I can't believe they did that to you." "I'm fine," he murmured, his voice low and steady. But both of them knew that wasn't entirely true. Their children, Lily and Jack, sat on the couch, their phones glowing in their hands. Both teenagers wore expressions of outrage. 16-year-old Jack's voice was the first to break the tense silence. "Dad, how could they do that? You're Captain Elijah Sanders. Don't they know who you are?" Elijah sighed, sinking into a nearby chair. He ran a hand over his face, the coolness of his palm offering little relief from the heat of his frustration. "It doesn't matter who I am, Jack," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's the problem. To some people all they see is what's on the surface." Lily, only 14, wiped at the unshed tears in her eyes. "But you didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Why does this keep happening?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Elijah didn't know how to explain the systemic injustice that had shaped so many lives, including his own. He had spent years leading soldiers, navigating the chaos of war, and making sacrifices for his country, yet in a moment, none of it had mattered. "I wish I had an answer, Lily," he said finally, his voice heavy with sadness. Amanda sat beside him, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Elijah, this is going viral," she said. "People are watching. They need to hear from you." He nodded slowly, though the thought of stepping into the public spotlight made his exhaustion deepen. "I'll speak," he said after a long pause, "but on my terms." The video of Elijah's arrest spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was plastered across social media platforms, gaining millions of views. The footage, showing a decorated military officer, an American hero, being handcuffed and humiliated, sparked outrage across the nation. Clips of the incident were dissected on news channels, replayed with somber commentary. Pundits debated the implications, civil rights leaders condemned the injustice, and social media users flooded platforms with hashtags like Justice for Elijah, End Police Bias, and Systemic Reform Now. The narrative resonated deeply with people across the country. Elijah's story wasn't just his own. It was the story of countless others who had faced profiling, mistreatment, or worse. His status as a respected military officer gave the situation an additional layer of poignancy, highlighting that even those who had served their country weren't immune to prejudice. Protests erupted in cities nationwide. In Elijah's own town, a crowd gathered outside the police station, their voices a thunderous demand for accountability. Signs reading, "Justice for Captain Sanders" and "No More Injustice" filled the streets. Chants of Black Lives Matter and No Justice, No Peace echoed through the night. The energy in the crowd was palpable, an electric mix of anger, pain, and determination. Families, students, and activists stood side by side, united by a shared purpose. Among the protesters was 22-year-old Clara Williams, a local college student. Holding a sign that read, "Respect our heroes," she spoke passionately to a reporter. "This isn't just about Captain Sanders," Clara said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is about a broken system that treats people of color as threats, no matter who they are or what they've accomplished. Enough is enough." As the protests swelled, the Sanders family remained in their home, their quiet refuge interrupted by the chaos unfolding outside. Elijah watched footage of the demonstrations on the evening news, his expression unreadable. Amanda placed a hand on his arm. "They're doing this for you," she said gently. "For us," he corrected. "For everyone who's ever been treated like this." The backlash against Officer Matthew Cole was swift and severe. Suspended from duty pending an investigation, Cole found himself at the center of a media firestorm. Reporters camped outside his home, microphones poised to capture any comment. His name was dragged across headlines and social media alike, with people calling for his resignation and criminal charges. Cole's neighbors shunned him, and his once tight circle of friends grew silent. Even within the police department, colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with him. For his part, Cole's initial reaction was defensive. He told those close to him that he had made a mistake, that he hadn't known who Elijah was. But as the outrage grew, his defenses began to crumble. Inside his dimly lit apartment, Cole sat alone, staring at his phone. The video of the incident played on a loop, the sound of his own voice, sharp and authoritative, clashing with the calm, measured tone of Elijah's response. Each replay deepened the sinking realization of what he had done. "I didn't know," he muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an excuse. The world wasn't interested in his explanations. To the public, he had become the face of systemic injustice, a symbol of the unchecked biases that had plagued law enforcement for decades. Meanwhile, Elijah grappled with his next steps. He hadn't asked to become a symbol, but circumstances had thrust him into the role. Amanda's words echoed in his mind. "People need to hear from you." Late one evening, he sat alone in his home office, staring at a blank page on his computer. Memories of the arrest flashed through his mind, the cold metal of the handcuffs, the sharp tone of Cole's voice, the murmurs of the crowd. He didn't want his voice to be just another reactionary response in a sea of outrage. He wanted it to mean something, to drive change. Finally, he began typing. The protests continued to grow, and their intensity captured national attention. In major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, thousands took to the streets. The footage of Elijah's arrest became a rallying cry, galvanizing a movement that had long been simmering beneath the surface. Outside the local police station, the demonstrations remained peaceful but charged with emotion. Community leaders organized speeches, sharing stories of injustice and calling for systemic reform. Elijah's silence during these early days only heightened anticipation. People wanted to know what he thought, how he felt, and what he planned to do next. "When will Captain Sanders speak?" asked one protester during a televised interview. "His voice matters. We need him to lead." Finally, after days of mounting tension, Elijah made his decision. He would speak, not as a victim, but as a leader. His family, his community, and the nation deserved more than silence. "It's time," he told Amanda one morning, his voice resolute. She smiled, her pride evident. "I knew you'd get there," she said softly. Elijah nodded. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice was just beginning. Elijah's words would spark a fire, one that couldn't be extinguished. The morning air was crisp as Elijah Sanders stood behind the curtain of the community center's stage. Beyond the barrier, a crowd of hundreds had gathered, their voices a gentle hum of anticipation. The energy was palpable. People had come from all corners of the town, and some even farther, to hear from him, to see what the man at the center of this storm would say. Elijah adjusted the lapel of his jacket, his fingers brushing over the subtle military insignia pinned there. Though he was no longer in uniform, the small detail grounded him, reminding him of the values he had spent his life upholding. Amanda appeared beside him, her calm presence offering a moment of reprieve. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her eyes filled with unspoken encouragement. "They're ready for you," she said gently. Elijah exhaled deeply and nodded. He had spent days reflecting on what to say. This wasn't just about him, it was about the countless others who didn't have the platform he did, whose voices were often silenced. This moment was bigger than his personal experience, and he was determined to honor that. As he stepped out onto the small stage, the crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Signs with slogans like "Justice for Elijah," "End Systemic Racism," and "We Stand Together" waved high above the sea of faces. Elijah paused, taking in the sight before him. He had faced combat zones, but the intensity of this moment felt different. The unique weight pressed on his shoulders. When the applause quieted, he approached the microphone. His deep voice carried easily over the hushed crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his tone steady but filled with emotion. "Today, I don't stand before you as Captain Elijah Sanders. I stand before you as a husband, a father, and a black man in America who experienced an injustice that far too many of us know all too well." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective acknowledgement of his words creating an undeniable connection. "What happened to me that night," Elijah continued, "should never happen to anyone. Not to a soldier, not to a teacher, not to a student, not to anyone. But it does, again and again, and that's why we're here today." A ripple of applause moved through the crowd, but Elijah held up a hand, signaling for silence. He wasn't finished. "This isn't just about me," he said firmly. "This is about a system that has allowed bias, prejudice, and injustice to take root. It's about every black man, woman, and child who has ever been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. It's about all of us standing together to demand better, not just for ourselves, but for future generations." His words struck a chord, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Elijah paused, letting the sound wash over him before continuing. "I've spent my life serving this country," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "I've led soldiers into battle, made sacrifices, and put everything on the line to protect the freedoms we hold dear. And yet, in a single moment, none of that mattered. I was reduced to a stereotype, treated as a threat, not because of anything I did, but because of how I looked." The crowd quieted again, the weight of his words sinking in. "That," Elijah said, his tone sharp with conviction, "is the reality for so many of us. And it's a reality we cannot accept any longer." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd, their voices echoing his sentiment. Elijah took a step closer to the microphone, his expression resolute. "We have a choice," he said. "We can let moments like this divide us, or we can come together and demand real, meaningful change. Change that ensures accountability, fairness, and justice for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or status." He paused, scanning the faces before him. In their eyes he saw hope, anger, determination, emotions that mirrored his own. "We're at a crossroads," he continued, "and I believe we have the power to choose a better path. But that power doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us, standing together, refusing to be silent, and demanding that this country live up to its ideals." The crowd roared its approval, the sound thunderous. Elijah waited for the noise to subside before delivering his final words. "This is not the end," he said. "This is just the beginning. And if we stand together, if we stay committed, I believe we can create a future where no one has to fear the people who are supposed to protect them. A future where justice is not a privilege, but a right for all." The applause that followed was deafening. Elijah stepped back from the microphone, his chest heaving with emotion as he surveyed the sea of faces before him. He felt Amanda's presence beside him, her pride radiating like a steady light. As the crowd began chanting, "Justice for Elijah, justice for all," Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a collective mission, one that he was ready to lead. But Elijah knew words were only the beginning. Now, the fight for change truly began. In a dimly lit apartment on the other side of town, Matthew Cole sat alone, staring at his television. The cheers and chants from Elijah Sanders' speech played on the evening news, the crowd's energy palpable even through the screen. The words hit Cole harder than he expected. Each sentence felt like a personal condemnation of his actions, or rather, his inactions. on that fateful night. He gripped the remote tightly, his knuckles white against the worn plastic. I didn't know, he muttered to himself for what felt like the 100th time. But the excuse sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Cole's apartment was a reflection of his current state. Unmade furniture, piles of unopened mail, and empty takeout containers scattered across the room. He hadn't been able to sleep or eat properly since the incident. His once proud reputation as a diligent officer was in tatters, and he couldn't escape the weight of his own guilt. The video of the arrest played endlessly on the news and social media. Every frame seemed to capture the worst parts of him: the aggression in his posture, the disdain in his voice, and the way he ignored Elijah's calm explanations. He had seen it replayed so many times that the memory felt almost surreal, like it had happened to someone else. But it hadn't. It was him. The police department's decision to suspend Cole without pay had been swift. Public pressure made it clear there was no room for delay. Protesters gathered outside the station daily, their chants loud enough to reach his apartment windows at night. He was no longer just Officer Matthew Cole. He had become a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement, the very image of unchecked power and systemic bias. As much as Cole wanted to hide from the world, Sergeant Harold Barnes had other plans. Bookmark. Go back. It was late afternoon when Barnes knocked on Cole's apartment door. "Cole, it's me." "Open up," Barnes called, his tone firm but not unkind. Cole hesitated. He didn't want to face his superior or anyone for that matter, but he knew he couldn't avoid this conversation forever. Slowly, he opened the door. Barnes stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the messy apartment before settling on Cole. "You look like hell," he remarked bluntly. "I feel like it," Cole muttered, sinking into the nearest chair. Barnes pulled a chair across from him, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Barnes broke the silence. "You know why I'm here," he said. Cole nodded, unable to meet his superior's gaze. "I screwed up," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Barnes leaned forward, his expression sharp. "Screwed up doesn't even begin to cover it. You didn't just make a bad call, you made a choice. A choice driven by bias, whether you want to admit it or not." Cole winced at the words, but he didn't argue. Deep down, he knew Barnes was right. "The department can't protect you from this," Barnes continued. "The protests, the media, it's too big. The chief is under pressure, and you're at the center of it all. Your suspension is just the beginning." Cole's stomach sank. "So that's it? My career is over?" Barnes exhaled slowly. "As a cop? Yeah, it's over. But your career isn't the only thing at stake here. You've got a choice to make, Cole. You can let this define you, or you can do something about it." Cole finally looked up. Confusion and frustration etched across his face. "What am I supposed to do? No apology is going to fix this." "No, it won't," Barnes agreed. "But acknowledging your part in this, owning your mistakes, that's where you start. And maybe, just maybe, you can help change the system you were a part of." The sergeant's words lingered long after he left. Cole sat in the silence of his apartment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to fully confront the reality of his actions, not just as an officer, but as a person. 2 weeks later, Cole found himself standing outside the community center where Elijah Sanders had spoken. The protests had quieted, but the energy of the movement remained strong. Inside, Elijah and a group of community leaders were meeting to discuss reform initiatives. Cole's palms were sweaty as he approached the entrance. He wasn't sure if he would be welcomed or if he even deserved to be there, but he knew he couldn't hide any longer. When he stepped into the meeting room, the conversation stopped. All eyes turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of surprise, anger, and skepticism. Elijah, seated at the head of the table, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Cole cleared his throat, his voice shaky but determined. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see here," he began. "But I came because I need to own what I did. I was wrong. I made assumptions I had no right to make, and I hurt someone who deserved nothing but respect." The room was silent, the tension thick. "I don't expect forgiveness," Cole continued, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "But I want to be part of the solution. I can't undo what I did, but I can help make sure it doesn't happen again." Elijah studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded toward an empty chair. "Sit," he said simply. Cole took the seat, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the moment. Over the following months, Cole committed himself to change. He attended community meetings, listened to stories of injustice, and worked with activists to understand the systemic issues he had been blind to for so long. He resigned from the police force, knowing that his place was no longer in law enforcement. Instead, he dedicated his time to supporting reform efforts. He spoke openly about his mistakes, using his story as a cautionary tale for other officers. It wasn't easy. Many in the community still viewed him with suspicion, but Cole was determined to earn back the trust he had lost. Elijah, while cautious, recognized Cole's sincerity. Their conversations were tense at first, but over time they found common ground in their shared goal of creating a better future. For Cole, redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about confronting it, learning from it, and doing the hard work of change. But redemption, like justice, is a journey, one that Cole was just beginning. The community center was no longer just a quiet gathering place for local events. It had transformed into the heart of a movement. Every evening, its large meeting hall buzzed with activity as people from all walks of life came together to discuss, plan, and act. Elijah Sanders stood at the front of the room, looking out at the group assembled before him. Some faces were familiar: neighbors, local activists, and friends who had supported him during the aftermath of his arrest. Others were new, drawn by the growing momentum of the cause. "Thank you all for being here," Elijah began, his deep voice carrying over the quiet murmur of the room. "What we're building here isn't just about addressing what happened to me. It's about ensuring it doesn't happen to anyone else, ever again." The crowd nodded in agreement. The passion in their eyes reflected the collective pain and determination of a community tired of being ignored. A young woman raised her hand. Her name was Clara Williams, a college student who had been one of the most vocal supporters during the protests. "Captain Sanders, what's the next step?" she asked. Elijah gave a small, appreciative smile. Clara's question was one he had been wrestling with himself. The protests had raised awareness, but awareness wasn't enough. The system they were up against was deeply rooted and resistant to change. "We need to move from protest to policy," Elijah said firmly. "It's not enough to call for accountability. We have to create structures that enforce it." He gestured to a banner hanging at the front of the room. In bold letters it read, "Justice, Accountability, Reform." "Our first step," Elijah continued, "is pushing for a civilian oversight board for the police department. This board would have the power to review cases of misconduct, ensuring transparency and fairness. No more officers investigating their own colleagues." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. The idea wasn't new. It had been proposed in other cities, but it was exactly the kind of concrete reform the community needed to rally behind. In the following weeks, the meetings at the community center grew larger. Activists, legal experts, and even former officers joined the effort, bringing their expertise to the table. The push for the Civilian Oversight Board gained traction, drawing attention not just from local officials, but from neighboring towns. Elijah worked tirelessly, balancing his role as a leader with the personal challenges of rebuilding his life. Amanda often reminded him to rest, but he couldn't slow down, not when so many people were depending on him. One evening, as the meeting wound down, Elijah found himself in conversation with a man he never expected to see in this space. Matthew Cole. The former officer had been attending meetings regularly, though he mostly kept to the background. Tonight, however, he approached Elijah directly. "Captain Sanders," Cole began, his tone cautious but sincere. "Elijah," he corrected, folding his arms. "Elijah," Cole repeated. "I just wanted to say, I know I've got a lot to make up for, and I know words won't ever be enough, but I'm here because I want to help. If there's anything I can do, anything, you let me know." Elijah studied Cole for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "If you're serious about helping, there's a lot of work to be done," he said finally. "This isn't about redemption, Cole. It's about building something better for the next generation." Cole nodded, his jaw tightening. "I understand, and I'm ready." The push for the oversight board reached a critical point when Elijah and a small delegation of community leaders were invited to present their proposal to the town council. The council chamber was packed that evening, with standing room only. Residents from across the community filled the seats, their presence a testament to the urgency of the issue. Elijah stood at the podium, his prepared remarks laid out neatly before him. But as he looked at the faces in the room, the council members, the audience, and his family sitting in the front row, he decided to speak from the heart. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'm not here today to talk about what happened to me. You've seen the video. You've read the headlines. But this isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern, a system that allows these incidents to happen over and over again." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This isn't about punishing police officers," Elijah continued. "It's about ensuring accountability. It's about building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And that trust begins with transparency." He outlined the specifics of the proposal. A civilian oversight board composed of diverse community members with the authority to review complaints, investigate misconduct, and recommend disciplinary actions. "This board isn't about taking power away from the police," Elijah said. "It's about ensuring that power is used responsibly, fairly, and justly. Because when there's accountability, there's trust. And when there's trust, we all feel safer." The room erupted into applause as he stepped away from the podium. The council members exchanged looks at their expressions, a mix of contemplation and pressure. The voices of the people couldn't be ignored. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, debates, and negotiations. Some council members pushed back, raising concerns about the feasibility of the oversight board. Others voiced support, acknowledging the community's overwhelming demand for reform. Elijah remained steadfast, attending every hearing and rally, speaking with clarity and conviction. His presence alone was a powerful reminder of what was at stake. When the council finally voted, the result was clear. The Civilian Oversight Board was approved. The announcement was met with cheers and tears of joy from the crowd gathered outside the chamber. Elijah stood among them, his heart swelling with pride and relief. Amanda was by his side, her hand firmly in his. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," he corrected, looking out at the sea of faces. As the Oversight Board began to take shape, Elijah's focus turned to the broader movement. Other cities had taken notice of the success in his town, reaching out for guidance on implementing similar reforms. Elijah found himself traveling across the state, speaking to communities, sharing his story, and offering support. At every stop, he emphasized the same message. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But when communities come together, when we stand united, there's nothing we can't achieve. The movement was growing, and Elijah knew there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever dreamed of a more just and equitable future. The community had taken its first steps toward change, but Elijah knew the journey was far from over. Matthew Cole stood outside the community center, staring at the familiar brick building. Inside, he could hear the faint murmur of voices, another meeting, another step in the movement that had grown far beyond what anyone anticipated. He hesitated before walking in, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Since the night he had wrongfully arrested Elijah Sanders, Cole's life had been turned upside down. His name had become a symbol of everything the movement stood against, a stark reminder of how deeply prejudice could poison the justice system. But Cole hadn't disappeared into the shadows. Despite the temptation to do so, he had resigned from the police force, knowing he couldn't continue wearing the badge with integrity. Instead, he had thrown himself into understanding the root causes of the very system he had once upheld. Cole's path toward atonement hadn't been easy. He attended every community meeting, often standing in the back, unnoticed by most. He spent hours reading, learning about the history of systemic racism and how it shaped the biases he had carried. Slowly, he began to speak, not to defend himself, but to take accountability. One evening, Cole was asked to share his perspective during a meeting. The room grew tense as he stepped to the front, the crowd unsure of what to expect. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Cole began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I can't undo what I've done. But I'm here because I want to be part of the change. Because if I don't confront my own biases, if I don't take responsibility, then I'll always be part of the problem." He paused, letting his words settle. The room was silent, the tension thick. When I stopped Captain Sanders that night, I didn't see him as a man, Cole admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I saw him as a threat, and that wasn't because of who he is, it was because of who I am. I let my fears, my assumptions, and my privilege blind me to his humanity. And for that, I'm deeply sorry. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. While some in the room remained skeptical, others nodded slowly, acknowledging the courage it took for him to speak. Elijah watched from his seat at the front, his expression unreadable. He had heard many apologies in his life, some genuine, others performative. Cole's words felt different. There was a rawness, an unflinching willingness to face the ugliness within himself. After the meeting, Cole approached Elijah. Captain Sanders, Cole began, but Elijah interrupted. Elijah, he corrected. Elijah, Cole said, nodding. I want you to know how much I regret what happened, not just for what I did to you, but for everything it represents. I can't fix the past, but I'm committed to doing better, whatever that looks like. Elijah studied him for a long moment before responding. Atonement isn't about words, Cole, he said. It's about actions, consistent, meaningful actions. This isn't about me forgiving you. It's about you proving to yourself and this community that you're capable of being better. Cole nodded, his jaw tight. I understand, he said. Over time, Cole became an active participant in the movement. He worked alongside Elijah and other community leaders, helping to implement the Civilian Oversight Board and advocating for mandatory bias training within the police department. He also took part in listening sessions, where members of the community shared their experiences with law enforcement. Many of the stories were painful to hear, and Cole often felt a deep shame for his role in perpetuating the system that had caused so much harm. But he didn't shy away. Instead, he listened, learned, and tried to use his experience to educate other officers. At one of these sessions, Clara Williams approached Cole during a break. Her initial skepticism of him had been clear from the start, but tonight, her expression was softer. I didn't think you'd stick around, she admitted, crossing her arms. Cole shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Neither'd I. Clara tilted her head, studying him. Why are you doing this? Because it's the right thing to do, Cole replied simply. I can't change what I've done, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again to anyone. She nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she considered his words. You've got a long way to go, she said bluntly. I know, Cole said, but I'm willing to do the work. Elijah watched these interactions carefully. He had seen people like Cole before, officers who made mistakes but never learned from them, who hid behind excuses or deflected blame. Cole was different. Though Elijah remained cautious, he couldn't ignore the progress Cole was making. It wasn't about earning forgiveness or redemption, it was about contributing to the greater good. As the months passed, the movement grew stronger. The Civilian Oversight Board began operating, and the first cases of police misconduct were reviewed with transparency and fairness. The community saw real change. Policies were revised, training programs were overhauled, and accountability became more than just a buzzword. Elijah often found himself reflecting on the journey. What had started as a painful personal experience had become a catalyst for systemic reform. The work was far from over, but progress was undeniable. One evening after a particularly successful meeting, Elijah found himself alone in the community center. The room was quiet now, the chairs empty, but the energy of the movement lingered. Cole entered, hesitating at the doorway. You've got a minute? He asked. Elijah gestured for him to sit. I wanted to thank you, Cole said after a moment, for giving me a chance to be part of this. I know I didn't deserve it. Elijah nodded slowly. You earned that chance, Cole. But remember, this isn't about me or you. It's about the work. The moment you lose sight of that, it's over. I won't, Cole said firmly. I promise. For the first time in months, Elijah allowed himself a small sense of optimism. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but moments like this reminded him why he kept fighting. Change wasn't just possible, it was happening. As hope grew within the community, Elijah knew the fight was far from over, but it was a fight worth continuing. Months after the incident that had forever altered Elijah Sanders' life, the town felt different. What began as a wave of outrage and pain had evolved into a powerful force for systemic change. The community was no longer just reacting, it was leading. The Civilian Oversight Board, once just an idea discussed in heated meetings at the community center, was now fully operational. Composed of local leaders, educators, activists, and even former law enforcement, the board's mission was clear: ensure accountability and transparency in the police department. Elijah sat at the long table in the Oversight Board's headquarters during their inaugural meeting. Around him were faces he had come to trust: Clara Williams, now a lead organizer for the movement; retired Officer Henry Wells, a longtime advocate for police reform; and Dr. Angela Ruiz, a professor specializing in criminal justice. Together, they were tasked with reviewing the first cases brought before the board. "This is what we fought for," Clara said, her voice firm as she opened the file on the first case. "Now, let's make sure we do it right." The room hummed with determination. The town's police department had also begun its transformation. Under pressure from the Oversight Board and the community, the department implemented a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training for all officers, stricter guidelines for use of force incidents, and regular community engagement sessions. For some officers, the changes were welcome, a chance to rebuild trust with the people they served. For others, the reforms were met with resistance. But the message was clear: the old ways were no longer acceptable. Officer Jessica Lane, who had intervened during Elijah's arrest, became a prominent figure in this new chapter. As one of the few officers who had publicly supported the reforms, she often found herself at odds with her colleagues. But she stood her ground. "This isn't about attacking law enforcement," she said during a town hall meeting. "It's about making sure we live up to the oath we took to protect and serve, all of us." Her words were met with applause, a sign of the growing unity between the police and the community. One of the most significant moments in the town's journey came during the department's first open forum, a meeting where residents could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. The forum was held in the same community center where Elijah had given his powerful speech months earlier. Elijah attended, though he chose to sit quietly in the back. He wanted to listen, to hear what the people had to say. One by one, residents stood and shared their stories. A young black man recounted how he had been stopped and searched for no reason. An elderly woman described the fear she felt whenever she saw police lights behind her car. Each story was a reminder of why this work was so important. When it was Cole's turn to speak, the room grew quiet. Despite his growing involvement in the movement, many people still viewed him with skepticism. "I'm not here to defend what I did," Cole began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "What I did was wrong. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and I hurt someone who deserved better." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But I'm here because I believe we can do better," he continued. "I'm not a police officer anymore, but that doesn't mean I've stopped serving this community. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to help in any way I can." The room remained silent for a moment, and then a small wave of applause rippled through the crowd. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. Elijah watched from his seat, a small sense of pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't about Cole's redemption. It was about the possibility of change, even for those who had once been part of the problem. As the months turned into a year, the impact of the movement extended beyond the town's borders. News outlets picked up on the success of the Civilian Oversight Board, highlighting it as a model for other communities. Elijah was invited to speak at conferences and panels, sharing the story of how his town had turned pain into progress. One such event was held in Washington, D.C., where Elijah stood alongside national leaders in justice reform. "Our fight isn't unique," Elijah said, addressing a packed auditorium. "What happened in our town happens across the country every single day. But we prove that change is possible when communities stand together and demand better." His words were met with thunderous applause. Back in town, the changes were tangible. Incidents of misconduct had decreased, trust between law enforcement and the community was slowly being rebuilt, and young people like Clara were stepping into leadership roles. At the community center, Clara and Elijah organized a workshop for local students interested in activism and public service. The goal was to empower the next generation to continue the work they had started. "These changes aren't permanent unless we keep fighting for them," Elijah told the group. "You're the ones who will make sure this movement doesn't lose momentum." One of the students, a teenage boy named Malik, raised his hand. "Do you really think things can get better?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Elijah smiled, his gaze steady. "They already are," he said. "But it takes all of us. Change doesn't come from one person, it comes from a community." The town's progress wasn't without challenges. There were setbacks, disagreements, and moments of doubt, but each obstacle was met with resilience and determination. For Elijah, the work was deeply personal. He often thought about that fateful night, about the humiliation and anger he had felt. But he also thought about the progress that had come from it, the conversations, the reforms, the lives that had been touched. One evening, as he walked through the now familiar halls of the community center, he paused in front of a photo on the wall. It was a picture of him standing on the stage during his first speech, the crowd behind him a blur of faces. Amanda appeared beside him, her hand slipping into his. "You've done so much," she said softly. "We've done so much," Elijah corrected, his voice filled with gratitude. As the movement continued to grow, Elijah knew there was still much to be done. The fight for justice and equality wasn't a destination, it was a journey. But for the first time, he felt a sense of hope. His town had become a beacon, a symbol of what was possible when people refused to stay silent. And while the road ahead was long, Elijah was ready to walk it, step by step, together with his community. The sun had begun to set over the small town, casting a warm orange glow over its streets. From his front porch, Elijah Sanders watched as families walked by, children played on bicycles, and neighbors greeted one another with waves and smiles. It was a scene of tranquility, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had engulfed the town just a year ago. Elijah leaned against the railing, his thoughts drifting. His journey over the past months had been transformative, not just for him, but for the community around him. The movement sparked by his arrest had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. The Civilian Oversight Board was in full operation, and its presence had already made a difference. Officers were being held accountable, and the relationship between the police department and the community had begun to mend. Incidents of profiling and misconduct had decreased, and trust, fragile but growing, was being restored. For Elijah, these victories were hard-won, but they were only the beginning. He knew the fight for justice and equality was far from over. The progress they had made was proof of what could be accomplished, but it also underscored how much work remained. That evening, Elijah attended a community forum at the town hall. It was the kind of event that had become a regular occurrence since the reforms began. An opportunity for residents to voice their concerns, propose ideas, and stay engaged in the ongoing movement. The room was packed, the energy vibrant. Clara Williams stood at the front, moderating the discussion with confidence and poise. She had emerged as one of the movement's strongest leaders, her passion and drive inspiring those around her. Elijah watched with quiet pride as Clara fielded questions from the crowd, her responses thoughtful and direct. "The Oversight Board is a step in the right direction," Clara said, addressing one resident's question. "But it's not a magic fix. We need to keep pushing for deeper changes, education reform, economic investment in underserved neighborhoods, and more resources for mental health support. This is about more than just policing. It's about building a system that works for everyone." The room erupted in applause, and Elijah couldn't help but smile. Clara's words reflected the broader vision they had been working toward, a vision that went beyond addressing immediate injustices and aimed to create a more equitable society. As the forum concluded, Elijah stayed behind to help Clara and the other organizers clean up. It was a simple task, but one that felt symbolic of their work, picking up the pieces and putting things back together. "You're doing great work, Clara," Elijah said as they stacked chairs. She glanced at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and determination. "I learned from the best," she replied with a grin. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't give me too much credit. This movement belongs to all of us." "Maybe," Clara said, "but it wouldn't have started without you." Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the room at the faces of the people who had become his allies, his friends. He thought about the countless hours they had spent planning, debating, and fighting for change. "It's not about how it started," he said finally. "It's about where we're going." As the months passed, Elijah's influence extended beyond the town. He was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and community gatherings across the country. His story resonated with people everywhere, not because it was unique, but because it was painfully familiar. At one event in Chicago, Elijah addressed a crowd of thousands. "Our work isn't just about fixing what's broken," he said, his voice echoing across the packed auditorium. "It's about reimagining what justice looks like. It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." His words were met with thunderous applause, but Elijah knew the applause wasn't for him. It was for the shared vision he represented, the hope that real change was possible. Back in town, the Sanders family found a new rhythm. Amanda continued to be Elijah's rock, offering him unwavering support as he balanced his growing responsibilities. Their children, Jack and Lily, had become more engaged in the movement as well, attending rallies and volunteering at community events. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Jack asked a question that caught Elijah off guard. "Dad," he said, his tone serious, "do you think it'll ever stop? The prejudice, the injustice?" Elijah set down his fork, taking a moment to consider his response. "I don't know if it'll ever completely stop," he admitted. "But I do know we can make it better. And that's what matters, doing everything we can to make the world a better place for you, for Lily, and for everyone who comes after you." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. Lily, sitting beside him, spoke up next. "You're doing that, Dad," she said quietly. "You're making it better." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "We all are," he said. On the anniversary of his arrest, the community gathered at the park for a day of reflection and celebration. What had once been a source of pain had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Elijah stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd that had assembled. Families, students, activists, and even members of the police department stood side by side, their differences overshadowed by a shared commitment to justice. As he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. "A year ago, I stood here feeling angry, humiliated, and uncertain about what the future would hold," Elijah began. "But today I stand here feeling something very different. I feel hope. Not because the work is done, but because we've proven that change is possible." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "This isn't the end of the journey," he continued. "It's just the beginning. There will be setbacks. There will be challenges. But if we stay united, if we keep pushing forward, we can build a future where justice and equality aren't just ideals, they're realities." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the air. As Elijah stepped back from the microphone, Amanda joined him on stage, wrapping her arms around him. Jack and Lily followed, their faces beaming with pride. Together, they stood as a family, a symbol of what the movement had achieved and what it continued to fight for. That night, as the stars twinkled above, Elijah sat on his porch, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this moment. The journey had been painful, transformative, and deeply personal. But it was also far from over. The fight for justice wasn't a sprint. It was a marathon. And Elijah was ready to keep running, step by step, alongside the community that had become his greatest strength. Because the truth was simple. Change didn't happen because of one person. It happened because of many, and together, they were unstoppable. The story of Elijah Sanders serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of standing up against injustice. What began as a moment of humiliation and anger transformed into a catalyst for change, not just for Elijah, but for an entire community. This story highlights several important lessons. First, change is possible when individuals refuse to remain silent. Elijah's courage to speak out and lead his community showed the power of collective action. Second, redemption is achievable for those willing to confront their mistakes, as Matthew Cole demonstrated through his sincere efforts to make amends and support meaningful reform. Finally, the story emphasizes that systemic issues require systemic solutions. By implementing policies like civilian oversight and mandatory training, the community created lasting structures to prevent future injustices. The journey toward equality and justice is long and challenging, but Elijah's story reminds us that each step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to a better future. If you found this story meaningful, let us know. If you think it was good, comment 1. If you think it was amazing, comment 2. We'd also love to hear your stories. Have you or someone you know faced challenges that led to change? Share them in the comments below. We're here to listen and learn. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Your thoughts and support mean everything to us, so take a moment to share your reflections in the comments. Together, let's keep the conversation going and build a community that believes in justice, equality, and hope for a brighter future.